The content of character, ethical sayings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Translator's note. Hadith classifications. Hadith literature, which consists largely of the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, together with descriptions of his character and behavior, is both rich and vast. Sadly, the majority of the Prophet's sayings have not been translated into English, and of the translations that have been made, many are either inadequate or outdated. Recently, however, many native English speakers, born and bred in the West, but trained in the traditional lands of Islam, are beginning to translate Hadith. This is indeed a bright development in a neglected field. While the perils are great due to the loftiness of the subject and the immense weight of responsibility, the need has never been greater. This collection was given to me by a young East African student of one of my own teachers, Habib Ahmed Mashhoor al-Haddad. May God sanctify his secret. The student visited me in California and explained to me the need for such a work in English and the immense impact the collection had on his native country in East Africa. He kindly parted with his only copy and left it in my possession, where it remained for some time. One morning, I decided to begin the day by translating 5 hadith from the collection. I ended up spending the entire day translating the complete work and spending several weeks thereafter reworking the translation. At a certain point, a translator feels the treachery of translation, the impossibility of it, but carries on for the importance of the attempt. There are many ways to turn a phrase, but even to hint at the sublime and succinct Arabic of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not in this mere mortal's capacity. I have tried my best, and I hope readers benefit from this translation as much as have the readers of the Swahili version of the sayings. About Hadith literature. To aid the beginning reader, I would like to clarify a few points about the rating of Hadith literature. Hadith are classified according to their strength, which means their probability of being accurate transmissions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's actual words, deeds and character. The science of Hadith classification, which emerged in the late 1st century Anno Hijrah, due to the number of fabricated Hadith that were spreading among the Muslims, is very precise and surprisingly modern and rigorous. It judges Hadith according to many sophisticated criteria, including the number and verifiability of their chains of transmission from the original narrators, and it rates them as sound, good, or weak, Sahih, Hasan or Da'if. Although many Orientalists have attempted to attack the veracity of hadith literature due to its reliance on human memory, they only succeed in exposing their own ignorance. To those who have taken the study seriously and have been blessed with hearing narrations from certified experts with prodigious memories that can perform exact recall, the reliability of both the transmissions and the classifications is remarkable. As the Arabs say, he who sees a wonder and he who hears it are not the same. The living masters of today, who still memorize a vast number of hadith, confirm undoubtedly the testimonies of previous generations concerning the memories of men such as Imam al-Bukhari. I personally had the benefit of spending time with a scholar from Mauritania who had memorized with chains of narration the entire 9 canonical hadith collections. This means that he had memorized literally tens of thousands of hadith along with hundreds of thousands of the narrators' names. The reader will note that this edition includes the biographies of the narrators of hadith in this collection, since their identities, reputations and capabilities are crucial to the chain of narration. Categories of hadith. Beyond the 3 basic classifications, sound, good and weak, there are dozens, some would argue hundreds of subcategories. The soundest hadith of all are the reports transmitted through multiple chains, mutawatir. These are considered analogous to incontestable factual information, such as the existence of Australia, though we may never have been there, or historical accounts that are undeniable, such as the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Less than 1,000 hadith have achieved this status. These are undeniably the words of the Prophet ﷺ and are considered equal to the Quran in legislative or creedal weight. The sound Sahih Hadith and the good Hasan Hadith number several thousand. The good are a degree slightly lower than the sound, analogous to a B versus an A in grading. According to most scholars, the sound classification is used in legislative but not agreed upon in creedal matters. On the other hand, good hadith are used in legislation and virtuous actions, but with more caution than the first 2 categories. They can also be used to support hadith from the first 2 in case of obfuscation in a matter. The third and most extensive category is the weak, da'if hadith, and depending upon certain factors, analogous to say a D- to C+ in verifiability. However, a hadith considered weak because of some fault in its main chain of transmission can achieve a higher status if its verifiability is strengthened by other chains, leading to an overall high probability of soundness. Moreover, some hadith are considered sound in meaning, though weak in chain. Some scholars will use weak hadith even for legal proofs in the absence of more sound transmissions or traditions. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, for example, is well known to have preferred weak transmissions to the opinions of men in legal matters. Some of the hadith in this collection are categorized as weak, da'if. However, they should be considered genuine sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, though with less reliability than either good or sound transmissions. For a weak hadith has never been considered forged. Forged hadith fall into an entirely different category. The weak hadith have simply been relegated to use only as counsel regarding virtuous deeds and acts of charity. The reason they cannot be used for legislation is that only the highest levels of reliability are accepted for such a grave matter. If there is reasonable probability that a hadith is inaccurate or less than authentic, it is not used for creedal or legal matters. It is, however, traditionally encouraged for matters of devotional practice that do not involve legal rulings, either penal or civil. Unnecessary dissension over weak hadith. Unfortunately, many modern Muslims have been indoctrinated into uncritically attacking hadith in this third category simply because they are weak. This is the result of a movement in the last century that desired to place Islam on a rational footing and to remove any traditions that diminished its claim to rationality. A purge of Quranic commentaries began, and many of the traditional stories that Muslims had borrowed from the Jews and Christians were attacked as well. Also, because several early scholars condemned the weak hadith, many modern Muslims dismissed weak hadith as unworthy of consideration. This is a mistake based on lack of information and a faulty method of reasoning. We cannot read correctly the scholarly statements that condemn weak hadith without taking into account the overall scholarly debate on the subject. If we discounted weak hadith without considering the traditional consensus of hadith scholars, we would end up rejecting some of the most beautiful statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and would do so unjustly and in opposition to the majority of hadith experts throughout Islamic history. Here, for example, is a very brief selection from the learned debate among sound scholars who were experts in hadith. Sidi Abdullah bin Hajj Ibrahim, who abridged the famous didactic poem, the Alfiyya of Al-Iraqi, says, if the hadith is not traced reliably back to the chosen Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the opinion about its use is either complete prohibition or complete permissibility. Commenting on this verse, Imam Hassan Mashat says, The opinion that a weak hadith is prohibited is that of Qadi Abu Bakr bin al-Arabi. He opined that even virtuous deeds and acts of devotion not related to law are nonetheless derived from the sacred law, and to use unreliable hadith is akin to possibly innovating acts of worship that God has not sanctioned. Regarding its permissibility, the opinion of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal is used, and according to a statement attributed to him, a weak hadith is preferable to the opinion of men. You should know, however, that the opinion that weak hadith should not be used is contrary to the consensus that Imam Sakhawi, says Imam Nawawi, mentioned in several of his writings. The consensus is that weak hadith are to be used in meritorious acts of devotion specifically. Shaykh Muhammad Jamaluddin al-Qasimi, the Syrian master of hadith sciences, a scholar who inclined strongly towards the opinions of Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, writes, "There are three opinions given concerning weak hadith. The first is they are not used. The second is that they are used without restraint. And the third is that they are used only for meritorious acts of devotion, and this is the soundest position." Imam Ibn Abdul Barr says hadith relating to meritorious acts do not demand the rigors of other types of hadith. Imam al-Hakim said, "I heard Abu Zakaria al-Ambari say, in the case of any hadith that does not permit something prohibited, or prohibit something permissible, or oblige anyone to an act, and that which relates to meritorious matters of commission or omission, I go easy on it and cast a blind eye toward it, concerning the rigorous reliability of its transmitters." Imam Suyuti says in his Tadrib, Ibn Hajar gives three conditions for the use of weak hadith. 1. It is not very unreliable. 2. It is in accordance with already proven principles. 3. If one does act upon it, it is done so without believing it is absolutely established. What should be clear from the above is that there was a difference of opinion in early Islam that led to heated debates, and thus the words of great scholars condemning the use of weak hadith have been faithfully recorded. But more importantly, the majority of scholars did not concur as to the prohibition of using weak hadith. On the contrary, later scholars reached a consensus as to their permissibility. Sophistry versus sound reasoning. Sophists often use a well-known fallacious technique in their unsound reasoning. They present only those views that support their premises. This is done in countless pamphlets today that are distributed free of charge in mosques around the world, misleading Muslims who have neither the time nor the training to fully investigate the matter themselves. Any researcher with an adequate knowledge of Arabic and access to sound texts on the science of hadith could author a pamphlet with sound narrations from some of the greatest scholars of Islam, proving categorically that weak hadith are an abomination and should not be used. Conversely, using the very same books to quote scholars of equal stature, the same researcher could produce a pamphlet proving that the use of weak hadith is valid as long as the one doing so adheres to the above stated conditions of Ibn Hajar. In fact, both positions exist, and scholars of the respective positions argued initially with great passion and unassailable belief that their own position was right. As time passed, however, both positions were examined in the light of all the arguments and those who made them. Later scholars concluded that the soundest position was permissibility, and that position has been taught in the great teaching institutions of Islam for many centuries. In any argument, the fairest and most faithful method is to present both sides and then, if there is one, present the preponderant position. Educated people are then free to choose which position they feel comfortable with. In the case of debates concerning religious matters, the Prophet ﷺ's advice is useful. Be with the majority of Muslims, and difference in my community is a mercy from God. The Quran reminds us that good people are those who hear words and follow the best from them. Our scholars gave sound and safe advice in their sanctioning of weak hadith, with the caveat that conditions must be fulfilled. The use of weak hadith for meritorious acts has been the practice of the Muslim community for centuries, and a well-known principle in the axioms of juristic methodology states matters of difference should never be attacked. This applies, of course, when the difference is among rightly guided scholars working within the orthodoxy established by the early first 3 centuries of Islam, those who have been recognized by the community of scholars over the centuries as being independent scholars, unfettered by precedent. Also, the matter must not be something any previous generations of scholars had reached a consensus about. If disinterested Muslims would adhere to these wonderful principles, the majority of problems in our community that involve religious dissension would end. Ramadan moon sighting debates would cease, as would arguments over the Mawlid, Burda, Inshad, and recitation of the Quran for the dead or in groups. Our rightly guided scholars of the past resolved such matters and countless other debates centuries ago. This reflects the beautiful diversity and freedom of practice within reasonable limits among our scholars. Their differing positions and even harsh and strong words on both sides can be used by ignorant people today to confuse, divide, and even lead people astray who do not understand the nuance of juristic reasoning and the possibility of having more than one valid practice or position on any given matter. I have translated this collection hoping to inspire people to practice good character with each other, overlook faults, desire mercy for others, that mercy might be shown to them, and to practice that noble prophetic example of treating others as indeed we ourselves would like to be treated.